And so I kind of wanted to to digress a little bit from the subject of compassion to the subject of suffering, which is much more fun, right? So, because this, of course, is why we have compassion, because we start to understand the nature of suffering, right? There's a link between wanting to help someone, ourselves, to be free from suffering, and the suffering. So, this is why Buddhism sometimes has a bit of a bad reputation, because we talk a lot about suffering, and some people are really over it. Like a lot of meditation groups that I've worked with, people are like, oh, don't talk about suffering. And it's like, well, this is like pretty much all the Buddha talked about. He talked about two things, really. He talked about suffering and the escape from suffering, freedom from suffering. And in that sense, he talked about the cause of our suffering so that we could understand it and become free from it. This is the the special teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of all Buddhas, is these four noble truths. And I don't know if you've heard of them. This is like the core fundamental doctrine of Buddhism. And this is a special insight that the Buddha had that allowed him to become liberated. And so these are the four noble truths. And I'll just go through them very quickly tonight uh, to help us understand better this subject of compassion. So the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. There is suffering. I'll come back to each of these individually, but I'll go through them uh, all at the beginning here. So there is suffering. That's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering, which is nice to know, right? The third is the cessation of suffering. And the fourth is the path that leads away from suffering, leads to the cessation of suffering. So these are the Four Noble Truths, and these are the special insight of the Buddha. And this doctrine is particular to Buddhist doctrine. So we need to understand these in detail. This will help us in our life, not just some random dogma. Like this is like really important information. When the Buddha talked about his path, he talked said this is the stuff that will help you come out of suffering. That's why I'm teaching you this stuff. And so if we really value compassion for ourselves and others, then we need to understand suffering. And so when the Buddha discussed the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, he gave a very particular definition. And I remember hearing a practitioner from a secular meditation group, and she said to me that she didn't think the Buddha talked about suffering, and that what he meant by suffering was experience. And so for her, she didn't want to talk about suffering. She thought that was very heavy and very down vibe. So she said, oh, yes, not suffering, it's experience, just experience. And I think it's very tempting to kind of sanitize these teachings and make them digestible for everyone. But it takes away the meaning and the profundity of these teachings when we kind of try to make it a little bit light, Lite. And so when the Buddha talked about suffering, he gave a very specific definition, which I'll share with you. And this is found in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha's first sermon. And he says, this is the noble truth of suffering. Rebirth or birth is suffering. Old age is suffering. I'm sure many of us are starting to agree. Sickness is suffering. Easy. Death is suffering. Pain, lamentation, grief, and despair are suffering. Coming into contact with things we don't like is suffering. Not coming into contact with things we like is suffering. Not getting what we want is suffering. In short, the Buddha said, these 5 aggregates of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, choices, and consciousness, in short, those 5 things are suffering. So there's a lot of information about that First Noble Truth. It pretty much covers everything, right? From birth to death and everything in between. But it doesn't mean that there's only suffering. The Buddha didn't say there is only suffering. You know, there's just this dissatisfactoriness that comes in life. And we feel it everywhere. You go on holiday, you've paid a lot of money, but the room's just not quite what you wanted. You've got this beautiful view, but there's a kid playing in the sand making a lot of noise. Or you order a fancy meal and it's okay, you know. The chocolate bar doesn't have the flavor you wish it would have, even though you've got a chocolate bar, you know. You find a perfect partner and they fart in bed. You have a beautiful sunrise and there's someone mowing the lawn, you know. There's just this little bit of suffering that creeps in to all of our experiences in a way. It's like never perfect, never 100% happy. There's always something just a little bit wrong. We're never quite free from suffering. And so that definition that the Buddha gives, you know, coming into things that we don't like, coming into contact with things we don't like, that's suffering. Not having the things that you like, that's suffering. You know, not getting what you want, that's suffering. And then that shorter definition of those 5 khandhas, we call them, those 5 aggregates, these are what makes up a human. You know, our form, this body, suffering. You know, we all get this, right? Yeah. It's harder to see how our feelings are suffering. That is like pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, neutral feeling. Harder to see. I mean, the pleasant feeling, we think, oh, that can't be suffering. But of course, it fades and disappears. So losing that pleasant feeling is suffering, right? Having it to begin with, knowing it doesn't last. Pleasure doesn't last. That's suffering. It's hard to see how our perceptions are suffering, but I mentioned just before that perception I had of that woman at the meditation center, you know. I can't trust my perceptions. They are unreliable. They constantly get me in trouble and cause me a lot of suffering. I don't know how it is for you with your perceptions of the world. Actually, the more solid our perceptions become, the more suffering we have. We become very fixed in our views, very judgmental, very predetermined in our thinking. And this forms habitual patterns in our mind. So if we're always like a little bit annoyed or irritated, if we're not careful, these perceptions can become very, very strong. And we get stuck with those kinds of thoughts. Our choices, these are the mental volitions, the sankharas, this is also suffering. And consciousness, having a, having a mind, that knows is also part of this problem of suffering, because this is what allows us to experience the world and experience that pain of suffering. So this is suffering. And I'll just leave, I'll leave that there. Probably we've all heard enough of suffering, right? The cause of suffering, the second noble truth, is the craving for continued existence that has kept us running around and experiencing desire in various realms. So I won't go too deeply into that. The Buddha gives it a little bit more, and he says there's 3 types of craving. Craving for sensual experience, kama tanha. Craving for continued existence, bhava tanha. And the craving for annihilation, or to not exist, vibhava tanha. So these are the cause of our suffering, our craving for things. Again, I don't want to speak too much about that. I'm just going to keep moving ahead because we've only got a short session. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. And this is a little ray of hope, a little glimmer of hope in this otherwise very depressing discourse, that there is an end to suffering, an end to suffering. And that this is something that the Buddha discovered when he became enlightened. Enlightenment is the eradication of suffering, the overcoming of suffering, the remainderless fading away of suffering with nothing left over at all. And this is enlightenment. And so this is how we overcome suffering. This is the aim of the spiritual path, to completely eradicate suffering, which, when we think about it, this idea of compassion is not just a surface thing. Oh, may they get better from their cold. May their broken leg heal. May they get money that they need to be safe and well. This is all very much important, but a little bit surface level. Buddha understood that coming out of suffering means the complete eradication of suffering, total eradication of suffering. And this is a very deep thing. In Buddhism, we believe in rebirth. You may not. We've got enough suffering in this life. But in Buddhism, the idea of suffering is not just this small slither of time, but this massive cycle called samsara, where we get reborn over and over again, and we suffer over and over again. The same kind of suffering you've got now, repeated ad infinitum, over and over and over again. You have loved and lost, you've grieved, you've hurt yourself, you've gotten old, you've got sick. And so when we talk about the complete cessation of suffering, this is what the Buddha is talking about. Not just having a good day here and now, but the complete eradication of that cycle of suffering that we've been doing over and over again for countless lives. So this is what that cessation of suffering means and why it's important. And the last thing, the last of the 4 noble truths, is the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So again, a little glimmer of hope that there is a path that we can take that gets us to this destination, this freedom of suffering, freedom from suffering. And of course, freedom from suffering is happiness, right? ultimate happiness. The more suffering you let go of, the happier you are. Makes sense, right? And so this path that we can take that leads to the end of suffering is the Noble Eightfold Path. Many of you will have heard that. And so that's how these Four Noble Truths, this core doctrine of the Buddha, fits in with this other well-known core doctrine, the Eightfold Noble Path, which is the path that we can take that will get us to the end of suffering. So what is the Eightfold Noble Path? I'll just go through it very, very briefly for you. Right view, seeing correctly into the nature of reality. Seeing correctly means to understand these things like suffering. Right intention, the kind of mind we want to develop. And it's a mind of love. It's a mind of compassion. And it's a mind of letting go. This is sammasankappo, right intention. Letting go, renunciation, love, compassion. This is the kind of mind that we take with us along the spiritual path. We also need to practice right speech. Speech, of course, is the thing that gets us in trouble, right? We need to practice right speech. We need to practice right action. We don't want to kill or steal or do actions that harm other beings. We want to practice right livelihood. We don't be involved in a livelihood that harms other beings. We want to practice right effort. We want to come out of suffering and develop happiness. We want to let go of unhappy minds and develop happy minds. This is right effort. We want to practice mindfulness, right mindfulness, samasati. And we want to develop deep meditation that allows us to see in accordance with reality. That's sammasamadhi. So this is the Noble Eightfold Path. I won't go into it now in more detail, but this is the path that leads to the ending of suffering. So these Four Noble Truths, then they're actually also tasks for us. We've got something to do with each of these Four Noble Truths. So with the Noble Truth of suffering, our job, the Buddha says, is to thoroughly understand it. With the second Noble Truth, the cause of suffering, we need to abandon that craving which causes us suffering. The third Noble Truth, the truth of cessation, we need to experience that for ourselves. And the fourth Noble Truth, the truth of the path that leads to cessation, we need to develop that. We need to practice that. Otherwise, we're not going to get there, right? I just want to come back to that first Noble Truth and the task involved. First Noble Truth of suffering, that there is suffering. Our task is to thoroughly understand it. And this is a challenge for a lot of us. We don't want to look at suffering. We don't want to experience it. We don't want any part of it. Thank you very much. And this is a problem for us because unless we see clearly the amount of suffering involved in this world, in this experience, in this body even, then we're not going to want to abandon the cause of suffering. We're not going to want to practice the path that leads towards cessation. We'll have no interest in getting out of suffering because our habit is usually to mistake pleasurable things for pleasure, when in fact often it's suffering. We mistake things like let's see, like getting really drunk for pleasure, but then actually we end up with a really bad hangover. Or we think, oh, I'm going to eat four tins of baked beans. What a pleasure. But then actually there's a lot of suffering, right? So everyone wants to go out for a fancy dinner party. No one wants to go to the toilet together. Uh, this body itself, we often think bodies are beautiful, right? Right? But you leave a body alone for even just a few hours, 24 hours, starts to smell a little bit, right? Yeah, if you didn't have all of those things, those deodorants and perfumes, those razors and laser whatever things, if you didn't have that hair dye or that shampoo or whatever, you might have a different perception of what a body is, right? And so we don't like to see these things as suffering. We like to cover it up and delude ourselves a little bit, like to make it more bearable. And this process is actually what we do with our entire worldly existence. We avert our eyes from suffering. We turn away. We cross the street to avoid the homeless person. We turn off the television when there's images of starving children. I never forget going to see a movie with a friend. It was a documentary. It was quite a shocking documentary. And my friend, he spent most of the movie with his hands over his eyes saying, I can't watch, I can't watch. And I was like, this kind of, this before I became a monk, obviously, I was like this fanatical Buddhist. I was like, never avert your eyes to suffering. Look at it, look at it. And we have to see really clearly. And this is why the Buddha's teaching is so special on this topic. It doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't mollycoddle us. He's not trying to sell tickets to his talks. He's like, there's suffering. And when we see suffering like this, there's two things that should happen. The first is we need to say, okay, this is suffering. We need to be able to identify it, to label it. This will be very helpful for us. And then hopefully there's this feeling of compassion that arises. If we don't get that compassion, then we're just going to be suffering even more, right? We're going to have this we're going to have this perception that becomes heavy, and it's going to feel overwhelming, like we've got nothing, there's nothing we can do. But at the very least, what we can do is have that mind of compassion. It doesn't mean that you have to go out, quit your job, save the world. It's not easy to save the world. Many people have tried. But that mind of yours, to not let it be hard and harsh, to not let it slip into denial, to refuse to see. Have a mind that really wishes, may they be free from suffering. Wishes, may I be free from suffering. Because when we have this wish, this is a spiritual wish. It's not a practical activity in the world, although it can become that. This wish is spiritual. If we were able to give rise to compassion in our hearts, and if we were to orient our life to overcoming suffering, the world would be a very different place. We would be very different people. And so when this mind of compassion arises, it's very beautiful. We see suffering, but it doesn't overwhelm us. Our response is that friendliness, that love, that metta, that wish for compassion, that they can be free from suffering. When we do this, we've already moved our mind a great deal. We're not allowing our we're not allowing ignorance to grow in our mind. We're not allowing delusion to cover up what we're seeing. When we see clearly like this, it's very profound. That's why the Buddha called it a truth. When we see a truth, it's very, very powerful. And so when we go about our business in the world, this is not a dress rehearsal. When we see suffering, we should respond with compassion. If we don't, we're putting these barriers up. Our mind is becoming hard, bristly. We're becoming slightly cruel, uncaring. Is that the mind you want? Is that the spiritual mind that you've been trying to develop? And some people might talk about things like compassion fatigue, that you can't possibly feel compassion for everyone all the time. And the Puritan Buddhists will kind of come back and say, but compassion is limitless. Compassion fills the universe. It's boundless. There's never a shortage of compassion. And this is true, right? Like, there's never a shortage of compassion. There's always compassion there. It's just that our capacity to access it, sometimes we just can't access as much compassion as we might like to. And that's okay. But the way we develop towards that universal compassion, that compassion that fills the universe, is to develop it in our own minds and make it bigger and bigger and bigger, so that is the default. That is the inherent nature of our mind. That is the way our mind is. And so when we encounter suffering in the world, this is the natural response, the kind, caring response. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to get frustrated with people, or that we're going to be able to solve everyone's ailments, or that we're going to be able to make the world suddenly a much better place, because that's the nature of samsara, this world of suffering. It's never going to be perfect. But what we can do is protect our own mind and to care enough about others, whoever they are, whatever their relationship to us is. And that alone is a very, very beautiful thing. And although it might not change the world, it might change your own headspace for the better, you'll feel good. You'll have a mind which is so warm and caring. And it should improve your relationships, right? You've got empathy. You see in yourself, I suffer. You look at them, they suffer too. This is the beginning of empathy, right? We care about others. And as we develop this compassion, the mind becomes more and more caring in a very deep, profound, beautiful way. And there's some beautiful images in Buddhist art of Kuan Yin, this being of compassion. And she's like pouring, she hears the cries of the world and pouring tears, I think it is, out of a vessel, and it's this incredible concern for all beings, this beautiful mind of compassion. And so this can become a very deep and very profound spiritual emotion. And as I said before, it should show up in our life somewhere. And that mind of compassion will guide our actions. And I think if we can continue to practice a meditation on compassion for some time, you'll see how it influences the mind. You'll see how your mind influences your speech and your actions. And you'll see perhaps that if more people did this, then the world would be a kinder, more caring, more beautiful, more loving, and a happier place. So it's a little talk on compassion and suffering, and a reminder that compassion is the wish that beings can be free from suffering. So I hope that will be of some use to you now or in the future. And I wish all of you to come out of suffering and to develop this mind of compassion for yourself and for all living beings.